Hi, everyone. I want to welcome you to the last lecture of the semester. It's been great seeing the discussion that's been going on. I was really impressed with your all's leadership demonstration. And for this week, there really isn't any major assignment due aside from your final paper. I didn't want to throw anything else on you. I'm making a slight change on the discussion board because typically in my previous iterations of this class, I'll give you all the last week of class off from your discussion board, but I decided I'd rather do that for the Thanksgiving week. But I'm just going to make the final discussion board just pretty simple, just pretty straightforward, and you won't have to respond to any classmates. So that should hopefully, again, help you out in terms of you finishing the paper for this class or in case you have any assignments due for any of your other courses. So again, this is the last lecture of the semester. I have been really doing my best throughout these 8 weeks to bring together both the leadership component as well as the communication component in terms of my background in communication. And so this lecture is essentially what I gave during my own leadership demonstration, my teaching demonstration when I applied for this job. And I've tweaked it here and there over the last few years because when folks ask me to give leadership workshops, for me, it feels irresponsible if I don't focus a lot of my attention on one, communication, and two, on team building and things that you should consider when you're putting together a team, when you're trying to manage a team. And so that's kind of how this whole thing got put together and the things that I think about when I put this presentation together. So let's go ahead and get started. So I started off using this GIF because for me, teamwork makes the dream work. But I'll use little funny GIFs and stupid things along the way. I like putting these throughout my presentations, especially in my workshops when potentially people are seeing me right after lunch and might need some levity to help with getting through the presentation. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, typically when people think about a organizational structure, right, they think about something like this, right? It's boss at the top, and the way as the phrase goes, all the crap just drops down, right? But I want to think about this a little bit differently, right? So I've identified 3 basic team members that you might interact with in any given organization. Like one, you have your foundational team members. And this doesn't necessarily mean your star people on your team, right? When people think of a foundation to your team, like a lot of folks think about it in terms of sports, right? Like you have the Lakers right now where it's like LeBron James is like the foundation of that team and they're bringing all these other pieces like Anthony Davis. But we're not thinking about it in terms of that type of foundational player, like someone that you rest on. And you kind of are, but it's a little bit different, right? These are people that have been with the company for a number of years, right? But at various different positions within that organization. So it might be someone in the mailroom. It might be someone who's been working as an office administrator for a while. They're the people that as soon as you get hired, someone will say, hey, you might want to go talk to Martha here because she's the one that's going to really help you out in terms of getting X, Y, and Z done. Or if you ever get lost, make sure you talk to Fred in this department because he's the one that knows the tips and tricks of getting things the way you need to happen, right? Those are your foundational team members. They're not typically going anywhere. Oftentimes, if you think about folks in like city departments or in school districts, these are the people that enjoy what they're doing. They have no issue with the salary that they have. They love that they're building up their retirement and their 401k. They're happy as a clam and they're just, working until it's time for them to retire. But they contribute a lot, right? They help maintain some congruity and consistency throughout the organization. Then we have our plateau team members, right? These are folks that enter the organization. And oftentimes these are your rock stars, right? They're going to reach a certain point in the organization, a plateau. And once they realize there's no more opportunity for growth or promotion, they're going to jump and go somewhere else. And oftentimes it has nothing to do with the organization. It's just a matter of the context and the circumstances where they know I've reached the highest I can get here, at least within this organization. I want to keep growing, so I need to go somewhere else. But while they're there with that organization and the time that they're there, they're still contributing on a large scale. And then lastly, we have our temporary team members. It could be interns. It could be someone who's only there for a couple of years and leave for a variety of reasons. But you'll end up working with a lot of temporary team members throughout your time, depending on how long you're with that organization. So these are three different types of people that you might have that I'm sure you, now that we put them in these concepts, you have an idea of who some of these people are in your real life situations. Now, I know we've talked about this picture already of what people think about with an organizational structure, but I want to start thinking about something like this, right? Where I've never competed in anything like this before, but from my understanding, right, not some of these folks are team members, but a lot of these people kind of go at it at their own. And you can see these people at the bottom helping people get to the top with the intent that once you get up there, you're going to reach down and help me get where you're at too, right? This is how we should be thinking about organizational charts and organizational structures. The fact that even though there is a hierarchy within most, if not all organizations, the idea is that we're all bringing ourselves up. When one of us succeeds, all of us succeed. And that should be the idea when it comes to thinking about building a team and maintaining a team. Now, in terms of this idea of being a boss, and I bring in a lot of stuff from Kim Scott, who her book is called Radical Candor. I have a picture of the book and of Kim later in this presentation, but it's a phenomenal book. I really highly suggest it for you all. The idea behind Radical Candor is that you are being incredibly forthright with your team, but you're also still kind of keeping into consideration who they are as a person and as a human and all those different needs, but still making sure that you're being radically honest with your team members. But anyway, she brought this idea because I think a lot of people in leadership positions forget about all that goes when they're entering in a new phase of leadership or they get hired in a new position. But you're in the middle of the circle here, right? And your responsibility is to guide your team, to oversee your team, look at the results of your team. But then if you go above that, you have your own responsibilities, right? Because when you get hired, you are not just simply getting hired to oversee people. You're going to have also your own responsibilities as an employee, as a leader that you have to be responsible for. And then outside of that, you have to still operate within the culture of your organization. Right? That's a lot of moving parts that you have to make sure you're keeping an eye on. And there's a number of ways that you can do that. And one of the best ways that you can do that is making sure that you're creating and maintaining a really good and successful team. So let's try to think about how we can do that. So the acronym I use to help me remember this is a new road, right? So we have to act decisively, normalize communication, show empathy, weather the storms together, respond appropriately, own the mistakes, be authentic, and develop consistently. So let's get into these one at a time. First of all, you want to act decisively, right? You need to make the necessary decisions as a leader. Invariably, that's going to show confidence, right? That you have thought about all the different scenarios, all the different options, the different circumstances, and this is a decision that you've made. When you show that type of confidence, it's going to resonate with your team. It's going to motivate them. But one thing that you should do is keep other viewpoints in mind and really listen to what other team members have to say, right? Allowing them to be part of the creative process and trying to come up with solutions. When I used to teach this in my hybrid classes, sometimes, depending on the class, we'd watch certain episodes of the HBO show Hard Knocks where they show the preseason of an NFL team. And I remember there was one team where the coach basically, someone was arguing with the head coach and he basically said, like, I'm listening to you, but this is my team. Like I'm driving this bus and you're riding this bus with me, right? And maybe when you're in this position, then you can make the decisions that you want. And then after that, he said, but if there's anyone else that wants to say anything, by all means, I'm all ears. But you're really not all ears, right? That you basically have just told your team, like, doesn't matter what you all say in this room, I'm making this decision, right? I have already made this decision. And granted, at a certain point, you do have to sit and say, like, this is a decision I'm going to be making. But you can't leave out that time period where you're open to ideas and you're trying to be as creative as possible in coming up with solutions. Normalize communication, right? I can't tell you how many times when I speak to someone who doesn't like where they work, they're thinking about going somewhere else, or they're just talking about the problems that are going on in the workplace. More often than not, when I ask them what's wrong, they say bad communication, but they really don't give a kind of detailed explanation of what bad communication means, right? So when it comes to communication, it's one thing to say that, I have an open door policy, or, I think about it in academics, there's always a professor who's like, my office hours are always open to you, feel free to drop by. But the way that professor kind of holds themselves in the classroom, oftentimes they make it very clear that you don't want any business of showing up and being a one-on-one with this professor in their office hours, right? They may just feel like they're hostile, or they may feel like they're not very open to that type of communication. And so I say we should push forward and not just saying that you're open to communication, but create different avenues. And even if you think about some of the articles we read at the beginning of the class, where we talk about how some folks get even more motivated by creating these opportunities for discussion and socializing. And that's something that you should do as a leader, is normalize communication and how often you have these opportunities for communication. So when you do that, that's going to lead to a few things, right? It's going to lead to listening and seeking to understand versus telling people what to do. It's going to be more to do with debating than directing, more to do with pushing people to decide than with being the decider, more to do with learning than with knowing. More to do with persuading than with giving orders, and more to do with learning than with knowing. And I think that's a big one for me, right? Because I can't tell you how many times I've run into people in leadership positions who feel like they've reached the pinnacle of learning, right? Like they know it all and they know exactly what they should do. And it really, again, cuts off that opportunity to learn and to grow and to be creative. And so regardless of what, kind of echelon you reach or position that you reach, you should be always open to learning from the people around you, especially from your teammates. I mean, one thing I talk about as an instructor is that as much as I am the instructor, I'm always really trying to learn from my students, because in reality, the combination of all my students in my class is going to be much smarter than me, right? I decided I was going to get a PhD, but that really just means I found this one very specific niche of a discipline, and I've just really dove deep into that one discipline. But outside of that, if you bring in all the different areas and topics that people could know, all the wealth of knowledge that's out there, my students are going to be much smarter than me, and they're going to know more than me. And so I do what I can to create an environment in the classroom where we can all learn from each other, right? Even when it comes to personal experience, always trying to make sure that I can learn from other people. We should show empathy, right? This is Kim Scott. This is her book, Radical Candor. Again, really highly suggest you check that out. But we should always keep our team members' lives and identities in mind, right? We should go beyond the golden rule. The golden rule is, treat other people the way that you want to be treated. But here's the problem. What if I'm the type of person who's like, you know what, when I screw up, I want you to call me out in front of the entire team and call me an idiot. Say, hey, idiot, this is not what you're supposed to be doing. This is how I want you to do that. That might work for me, but that sure as hell is not going to work for a lot of other people. So you should go beyond the golden rule. Really try to learn what your team members are all about and how they want to be communicated with, right? Then you can really understand how to keep your team functioning on a high level by creating these different avenues for communication, different styles of communication. And you should care personally, but challenge directly. That's the whole idea behind Radical Candor is this. You should care personally about your team, but challenge them directly. When it comes to empathy, it also means that as a leader, we are aware of the different identities and diversity within our organization and within our team, right? Really understanding personal experience, your team's experience, providing support, and providing empathy. That includes understanding or doing what you can to know that you might not ever be able to understand the different identities of your team members, right? And I'll use myself as an example. I remember I had a mentor a few years back who was helping me write this paper about what it was like living in the border, and kind of detailing my own experience, right? So we're talking about, socioeconomics, we're talking about race, we're talking about, sex. And then he asked me about if I was going to have a discussion about my sexual orientation in my paper. And I said, no, that's not something I really have to think about or was going to include. And this mentor was gay, and he stopped me there and he said, that's something you need to think about, because you don't have to think about that because you're straight. I have to think about that all the time, because often people look at the way I dress or look at the way I move or look at the way that I talk. And that's the first thing outside of me being Asian that they think about. But you don't have to think about that because you're straight. It led into this big discussion of the fact that, I've never had to think about these things before. I never had to worry about, not being able to marry someone that I wanted to be married to, or being worried about getting fired because of who I love. These are all things that I never had to think about, right? Because of the fact that I was straight, I was born straight. These are things that I don't have to consider, but once I get into a leadership position, I have to understand some of the things that some of my team members might have to deal with. Similarly, I was doing this, one of these kind of HR seminars where they go through all the different things you need to know when you get hired into a new job or when you're just going through training. And we started talking about the differences in terms of like the experiences of men and women. And they were talking about, encouraging faculty to make sure, like, if your class gets out late, that, people maybe that they can buddy up together so not, women aren't walking to their cars by themselves, things like that. And someone asked, has anyone here ever had a family member or friend give them tips on what to do to prevent themselves from getting sexually assaulted in public? Right? Only women raise their hands. Right? As a man, that's not something I normally have to worry about. I might have to worry about getting robbed, but I never really have to worry about it. It's never been something that's on the top of my mind of worrying about getting sexually assaulted when I'm walking late at night from the mall to my car, from a bar to a car, anything along those lines. Right? And it led into a more thorough discussion about the differences. And one of my colleagues brought up this poll that went out that asked women, if all men had a 9 p.m. curfew, how would that change, or what would you do differently? And a large majority of women just said they would go for a late night walk or run, right? Again, those are different types of stresses and concerns that are just not part of my everyday life. Like my day-to-day daily interactions, that's not something I have to think about. But as a leader, that is something that I should consider, right? If I have a night where my team has to stay later than usual, right? Am I considering the fact that some of the women on my team aren't going to feel comfortable, right? Or not going to feel safe getting home? And what can I do to alleviate that so that's not a concern? And similarly, as we've talked about sexual orientation and we're talking about gender, you also have to talk about race. The fact that there are so many people, black and brown people and different minorities that that are clearly being treated a little bit differently in this country, and sometimes a lot differently in this country because of the color of their skin. And again, that's something that we should consider as leaders, right? Because it does not mean that because you have a certain sexual orientation or gender or race that your life isn't hard, right? Like just because I'm a straight male, that doesn't mean my life is completely easy and never had any difficulties. All it means is some of these things didn't make my life even that more difficult. Right, and that's something we should think about, because as difficult and as hard as our journey to the top might have been, someone's journey might have been even harder to get to the middle. So we should really think about these things in terms of the empathy that we show our team members. We should weather the storm together, right? So obstacles are going to come. It's just a matter of figuring out different ways that we can face these difficulties together, right? So you want to support your team members during their personal storms. And more importantly, when we talk about empathy, touch base with your team, right? If someone tells you that their kid has been sick for a while, if someone tells you their parent has cancer, if someone just says that they're going through some financial issues, or if anyone feels compelled to share something personal with you of a difficulty that they're going through, it's one thing to show compassion. It's another thing to then circle back and say, hey, I'm still invested in what you're going through. Is everything still okay? Right? You still have to make sure you maintain those personal boundaries, but I think it goes above and beyond in terms of showing that you really are caring and supporting the team members that you have. Respond appropriately. Right? So if you need to critique someone, critique them. If someone did well, you should let them know that as well. Here's the thing though, if someone isn't making the necessary progress, you need to tell them, but then you need to guide them. Right? I use the example of myself of like, if I were, there are some classes where I have students turn in one paper halfway in the semester, and it's kind of a progression. So they'll turn half of a paper in the middle of the semester, and then they'll add on to it and then turn in a final paper at the end of the semester. Now, if I were to grade students in that middle paper but not provide any type of feedback, it would not make sense for me then to expect them to do just exceptionally better at the end of the semester at their final paper if I didn't give them any guidance. And we understand that in school, right? Throughout the entire time you go through school, like you're turning things in, you're getting feedback from the instructor, and you're learning along the way. But for some reason, we get to the workplace and people just think that people are going to understand what exactly we want. Right? Other people have a whole wealth of knowledge and practical experience, and they think of doing things in a particular way that might be different than what your expectation is. So if you see someone that's doing something that's not exactly what you want, it's important for you to have that time where you communicate exactly what you want and what your expectations are. This is a big one. Say thank you. I can tell you how many times I talk to folks and they say, more than anything, they just want to feel appreciated at work. It has nothing to do with the pay. It has nothing to do with their hours. They just want to know that their hard work is being appreciated. I understand there are some folks that think, Well, you got hired to do this job, so I'm expecting you to do that job. And of course, that's true. But it does show a lot if someone is doing the job adequately, if they're going, not just if they're going above and beyond, but even if they're doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing, that just means they haven't stopped, right? That means they have continually showed up and done exactly what's expected. And I think it costs you nothing to then go up at a certain moment and say, hey, I really appreciate the work that you're doing, right? That goes a long way in showing appreciation. And remember, like we talked about before, remember to care personally, but you want to challenge them directly, right? You don't necessarily want to like baby everyone and feel like you have to walk on eggshells. It's okay to critique someone, right? You want to let them know that you still feel that they're capable of doing what you hired them to do, right? A little bit of guidance, a little bit of criticism is okay, especially if you believe that they can handle the responsibility and the role that you've given them. You want to make sure you own the mistakes, right? You want to make sure you own your own mistakes. You want to make sure you own the team mistakes. But here's some advice, right? So my suggestion is that you own individual mistakes privately, right? If it's a team mistake, you can do that kind of in a general room, talk about the things that we all could have done better. But privately, I think about it in terms of like I have a friend who is a therapist, like a family therapist, and they always talk about the parents who yell at their kids in the middle of like Target, right? The kid already knows that they're doing wrong, right? And so getting disciplined is one thing. The shouting then adds embarrassment and humiliation into the mix, right? And how much learning from that moment is really going to go on when you have all those different emotions going on. And I'm not saying you're treating your team members like children, but I think that same lesson will still apply, right? It's one thing to correct your individual or that team member, but it's another thing to humiliate them in front of the rest of the team, because then you might change the dynamic of how they're perceived by their team members and their colleagues, right? So you want to own the team members publicly, but privately, maybe pull that person aside, explain what some of the situations are and maybe how they kind of messed up and ways that they need to improve moving forward. But you can still find teachable moments, right, and harness that potential. So if someone made a mistake and you think it might be something that a lot of other people could make, it's a mistake other people could make, then say, pull everyone together and say, look, someone did this and this is not the way that we want to approach that. I can understand why they did it this way, but here's how I want you all to handle it moving forward in case you see this, right? You were able to correct the mistake, and now you're also preventing things from happening in that way in the future. You want to be authentic, right? I don't like this guy. I'm not a Patriots fan. For those who don't know, this is Bill Belichick. He's the head coach of the Patriots, arguably one of the best head coaches in NFL history. Now, I use him as an example because when it comes to leadership, I think you should be your true self. And Bill Belichick has been so successful that there was this pattern in the NFL that folks would hire his coordinators, his offensive coordinators, his defensive coordinators, with the hope that we are going to bring the success of the Patriots to our team. It didn't work out a lot. A lot of these coaches that moved from offensive coordinator to then head coach of other teams ended up fizzling out. In fact, just recently, the head coach from the Lions used to be the defensive coordinator for the Patriots, and he just got fired. Now, my kind of sense making around that is a lot of these guys go from offensive coordinator or defensive coordinator. They show up to this new gig and they try to be like the new Bill Belichick, and it's not authentic, right? Like not just players, but people can feel when someone's not being authentic, typically. And so your job when you get into a leadership position is to be your authentic self. I think it's the same way. I'm sure all of us have that friend or family member who thinks they're hilarious and they crack jokes all the time, and those jokes never land. They're trying to be something that they're not really necessarily good at. You need to figure out what you're good at, what your own strengths and weaknesses are, and harness those and kind of like carve out what your personality is as a leader, right? Lead in a way that makes sense with your personality. And lastly, you want to develop consistently, right? So you want to focus on the direct reports. So think about a larger organization where you have your direct reports and they have a bunch of folks that they're managing. You really want to focus on them, right? It doesn't mean you're neglecting the rest of your team, but if you focus on them, you're able to spread out your organizational culture that you're really trying to create, right? Because those relationships may not scale, but the culture does, right? You might not be able to. So if you create a really good relationship with Brenda, who is one of your direct reports, that doesn't mean that same relationship is going to translate with all of her team members, but the culture that you create with Brenda and the other folks at her level, that will scale out to their team members, right? You can oftentimes, if you think about the different organizations that you've been a part of, typically the personality of the main leader ends up transcending the entire organization. You kind of just feel and sense their personality kind of getting a thumbprint all over the organization. You have to think about that when you're in the leadership position, and how often that culture and that imprint you're leaving on your direct reports can then filter out to the other people. And lastly, when it comes to developing consistently, develop the innate talent on your team. Right, so I use this picture of Antonio Gates, who used to be a tight end for the formerly the San Diego Chargers, and I use this picture because Antonio Gates was actually a really good basketball player, but by the time he graduated from college, he talked to, I believe, his agent or some coaches, and they told him, you're kind of an in-betweener. You're not going to be. We do not think that you would be that successful at the pro level in terms of the NBA. But there were some coaches in the NFL who were interested in him because he's 6'4", 255 pounds, and ran a 4.5 40, right? Like, you can't coach someone to be 6'4" and 255 pounds and to run a 4.5 40. You can improve some of those things, change some of those numbers a little bit, but just in general, coaches saw his talent and his athleticism and thought, we can figure out a way to make him successful in our team. And he still holds a ton of records as one of the most successful tight ends, not just in for the Chargers, but in terms of the league. And you should be doing something similar with your team members, right? Like, in normalizing communication and showing empathy and getting to know your team members, you should get to know what other kind of passions that they have, right? So if you have someone who is in the accounting department and you get to know them, and then all of a sudden you realize that on the side they do graphic design or they do photography or something along those lines, and it just so happens that you have a need in a particular department for marketing or graphic design, then it might behoove you to say, hey, look, every Friday after you come back from lunch, you're not going back to accounting. You're going to go to the marketing department and you're going to work with the graphic design team and share whatever ideas you have, right? And that might change and alter that department for the good. It might help the entire organization, and all of a sudden this person who is very good at accounting is now able to pursue some of their passion with graphic design because you've created that opportunity. But that's not possible if you don't get to know your team members. One thing that I do with my public relations students is about halfway through the semester, I'll pull a few of them aside after class and I'll say, look, everyone in this room I pulled aside because you're naturally gifted public speakers. Whether you're actually good at putting together a presentation, that's not the reason why I pulled you aside. I pulled you aside because regardless of the content, you're very good at sharing it. And when you get into public relations, you learn pretty quickly that not everyone is good at that. There are some folks who are going to come up with really great PR campaigns, strategies, techniques, things like that, but they're not really good at sharing those ideas or leading a team vocally. And so I pull them aside and say, regardless of what other positions you may get when you get into PR, even if you stay in PR, you're good at public speaking, and that's something that can really help in terms of creating relationships and success for your team members, right? If you know someone that's in a position where they have some really great knowledge, they have a really great idea, but they don't have the confidence or skills to voice that, like, volunteer to be that voice, right? Like, team up with that person. All of a sudden you can be a really great team together. You should be doing things like that with your team members, right? Really trying to figure out what other things that they can bring to the table that they might be really excited to share. And you're only going to know that if you kind of follow some of these suggestions, I'll call them, that I've laid out in this presentation, right? Getting to know your team, normalizing communication, being empathetic, being decisive, all of these things kind of play together. So thank you again for a really great semester. This is the last lecture that we have. Good luck in your final papers. And if you have any questions at all, please feel free to email me or reach out during my office hours. But good luck.